So we are going to start with a virtual keynote by Marian Krüger. Due to a last-minute sort of coincidence, he unfortunately couldn't come with us in person, but he's with us online. So Marian Krüger is co-founder and managing director of Remove, a non-profit organization focusing on supporting early-stage carbon removal startups and fostering carbon removal ecosystems in Europe and India. Behavioral economist by training, Marian previously headed the Sustainability and Business Lab at ETH Zurich, advised industrial companies and public institutions on decarbonization, and founded a successful startup in the solar PV space. And he just wrote a book on carbon removal, which is sort of a primer. So for all of you, sort of, if this is your first decarb event, essentially what we do mostly is try to explain complex sort of concepts and phenomena in an easily accessible way. And that's why I think having Marian to sort of start explaining you what carbon removal is and what we need to know about it is the best way to start. So Marian, over to you.
Thanks, Nils. All right, here we are. Now I can screen share. All right. Indeed, I would have loved to be there in person and see all of you in attendance. But yeah, this was a very unfortunate short notice thing that happened. Nils already said I run Remove, and I, together with Benedict Probst, recently wrote a book, which is sort of going to be a bit of the outline for the keynote that I'm giving you guys right now. The impetus for the book, and also where I wanted to start this discussion, was that, of course, we're beyond the point where the climate crisis is something that companies are ignoring, right? It's very clear. A lot of them have already set ambitious climate targets, and we, Benedict and I, who wrote this book, were approached by a lot of them in our separate positions around, okay, now we've pledged, we said we want to reach net zero 2030, 2040, 2050. How do we actually get there, right? And what role do compensation, do carbon removals play? This is all a big jungle. How can we find our ways and navigate here? And then if we zoom out a bit, and just look at the way that these goals are currently being discussed about, you could think, well, we're actually already there. And a number of these companies also said, well, if we look at our peers, it seems like they've already done the job, right? You can now go skiing climate neutrally, apparently, right? You can buy climate neutral oil, which in itself sounds like quite an oxymoron, right? Or if you have a kid at home, you can feed them food that is not only good for their stomach, but also apparently good for the climate. So they approached us and asked, wait, is this even legit? How are they getting there, and how can we do the same? Well, I don't think it's news to any one of you that a lot of these claims are unsubstantiated at best, if not even more, because we have a number of problems that are existing with how they come to these claims and the compensation projects that lie behind them. What these compensation projects are, I'll get to in a minute. One, study after study has shown that these projects actually do not deliver actual climate benefits, or the vast majority of them doesn't. These projects then could be avoided deforestation in the Amazon, or exchanging cook stoves in the global south, which of course are things that we should be doing. The question is whether they should lead to, and this is the second point, us still emitting and using these projects to then compensate for those emissions. Right, quick detour here. The vast majority of projects that are being used right now to compensate for emissions are so-called avoidance or reduction credits. Credits or projects. So if we imagine we have a company in Germany that is still emitting, right? We still have 1 ton of CO2 emitted into the air. And then they pay a company B or a project B in the global south not to emit. For instance, by avoiding deforestation, where typically then the CO2 that had been taken up by the tree is re-emitted into the atmosphere. So the carbon mass then is 1 minus 0. So we still end up with 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a problem because that has a global warming potential and effect on the climate crisis. What we should be doing instead is, if the company A in Germany still emits 1 ton, then we need to do something to take that ton out of the atmosphere to end up at 0. So it's 1 minus 1 equals 0. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the compensation projects, and also the ones that lie behind a lot of the claims that I just showed you, be it skiing, be it climate neutral oil, they're avoidance projects, which means we still end up with 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's a third one. If now we've sort of accepted that the avoidance paradigm is not the right one, but we actually need to remove, a lot of these projects also don't incentivize carbon removal. Right? We're going to get to discussions around price later on in the panel. But because these compensation projects still exist and are quite cheap, they're not incentivizing us to do what we actually need to do, namely remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So if we then think about net zero, and if there's only one thing you take away from today, I think it's this, at least from this panel. Talking about net zero implies the need for carbon removal. Otherwise, we'd be talking about absolute zero, right? Carbon removal, so the taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it globally, is actually what puts the net into net zero. And on our way towards this net zero goal and beyond, this is a graph that Devina, I'm sure, knows very well. It's from Carbon Capture organization, which has produced a lot of amazing resources on this. So I borrowed this from her. CR, carbon removal, fulfills 3 functions. One, already today, any carbon removal that we do helps us reduce the net emissions that we still have, right? Every emission that we take out of the atmosphere and store it durably has a reduced effect on the global warming potential and on the climate crisis. Secondly, and this is what we oftentimes think about with carbon removal, it helps us compensate for the residual emissions that we still have at net zero. So of course, the vast majority of our climate mitigation efforts and results will come from reduction. Very, very clear, right? But there's going to be some residual emissions that we will not be able to get rid of, or only very expensive to get rid of. For those, that's where carbon removal comes into play, to compensate for it, to then create this balance, this net of net zero. And then beyond that, actually, if we think about it, we've put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, which has caused the mess that we're in right now. So carbon removal gives us an opportunity to actually address those historical emissions. So to clean up our mess by going net negative. So by going beyond the remaining emissions we have and into the negative, taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere that we're actually putting into it. How are we doing this? So in the book, we tried to write this in a way that even if you've had your last interaction with biology, chemistry, physics in 10th grade, you still found a way to understand it. Typically, all carbon removal works in 2 carbon cycles. And there is an analogy that we've used, which I think works quite well to understand this. If you think about your checkings and savings account, right? Checkings account is where your salary comes in, but it also is where you pay your lease from. It's where you pay for groceries, for Kita, for everything else. So there's a lot of transactions, money flowing in, money flowing out. The short, also known as biological carbon cycle, works in a very similar way, right? It takes up CO2 through photosynthesis most of the time, but that CO2 is also getting re-emitted quite quickly, either because plants decay, or because a forest burns, or because we consume the plants and then breathe out the CO2 again. So the durability of that CO2 storage, how long that CO2 is out of the atmosphere, is quite limited. On the other side, if we think about the good old Sparbuch, right, about our savings accounts, a lot of the time, nothing happens. There might have been some inflow of money in the early innings, and then not a lot of things happen. There might be some interest flowing in, but in essence, the number of transactions is very, very low. The long geological carbon cycle works in a very, very similar way. That's also why it's called geological. Actually, a lot of the CO2 is stored in geologic formations, or in minerals, in stones and rocks. So the durability of CO2 storage is very, very high here. You need to go through big length to actually take out the CO2. Now, in a sort of natural equilibrium, these would sort of, this would have been in balance. But what we've done as humanity is actually, you could say, we went into debt on the long carbon cycle by taking out fossil CO2, which is the geological carbon cycle. We took it out and turned it into the short biological carbon cycle by using it for jet fuel and various other things that we consume every day. So this sort of as a backdrop to the variety of carbon removal methods that actually exist. Again, a great graph from Carbon Gap, shout out. There are multitudes of ways that we can do this. I'm not going to go into all the details, but just so you've seen and heard some of them, here is a selection. The most sort of easy to come to mind one probably is forestation. Just plant trees. It's not as easy as that. You can't plant trees in the right and in the wrong way, and you can restore nature in the wrong and in the right way. But that is, of course, one way to take up CO2 through photosynthesis. We can store, and we heard it in the panel before, building material is an option to store CO2, right? You can mineralize CO2 in concrete. You can put biochar into concrete. Then we have various opportunities. I'm going from the left top down now to do carbon removal in the marine space, in the ocean. You could grow macroalgae, microalgae. You could restore seagrass meadows. All of these take up CO2, in this case, through photosynthesis. Then there are various ways of mineralizing CO2, either to store it in geological formations deep underground, or to use what is known as enhanced weathering. So that works with alkaline material that has rocks that have a certain pH. They are being grounded very, very thin and then spread out, for instance, on agricultural soils. And what then happens is, if it rains, the rain takes up a bit of CO2 that is in the air. And that lightly acid rain then reacts with the alkaline material that we've spread out, and it forms into bicarbonate, and it's stored away for a long time. Now, going top right, biochar you might have heard of. It is a way to take biomass that has taken up CO2 through its growth, and we then put it into a machine that is called a pyrolysis machine, and it is being combusted without oxygen there. And then it essentially turns into charcoal. But of course, we're not going to use that for barbecue because otherwise the CO2 would be re-emitted again. But there are ways of either putting it out on soil because it has positive effects on soil health, but you could also store it elsewhere, for instance, in concrete. There are other ways to work with biomass that has taken up CO2. You can, for instance, burn it and capture the CO2 before it's emitted into the air and store that CO2. You can also take just the biomass itself and bury it underground in a way that it doesn't decay. The next one is soil carbon sequestration, so that, as the name suggests, we try to enhance the capacity of the soil to capture and store CO2. And then the last one is one that you might have also heard about. Certainly you've seen images if you've looked at carbon removal. It is what's known as direct air capture and storage. Essentially, it almost is like a big fan that takes in CO2 that takes on atmospheric air on the one end. It then has a chemical that reacts selectively with the CO2, binds the CO2, and then the outside of the fan, you essentially have air without CO2. And then we take the CO2 and store it geologically. So as you can see, this is just a first idea of what carbon removal is. There's further permutations left and right, but it is a quite complex field. It's certainly not one thing, which also, I think this image shows quite well, actually, all our biosphere and our geosphere are opportunities for us to do carbon removal. Now, if we look at where we need to head and where we're right now, the IPCC suggests we need 5 to 10 gigatons of carbon removal per year. So that's billions of tons. This is to compensate for the residual emissions that we'll be left with. Germany alone will probably require something along the lines of 40 to 100 megatons per year in 2045 when it's pledged to be net zero. Where do we stand right now? The global supply of durable carbon removal is 1.3 megatons. So we have a massive way to go. Actually, we need to scale up from where we're at right now by a factor of by 1.5 million%. So this is a massive undertaking. This industry, if it is at 5 to 10 gigatons, will be as big as the oil and gas industry is today. And we have some urgency, right? Because if we think about the solar industry, we had more or less 60 years to scale it up. 2045 is about 20 years away, right? And 2050, 25 years away. So if we don't have the time it took for solar to really scale, we need to really speed this up. But talking about solar, there's a few things that we can learn from him. And if you haven't read it, I'm sure some of you have had a look. There's a great book by Greg Nemeth called How Solar Became Cheap. Lots of things to learn about how green technology can scale. And there's things that we in carbon removal certainly can take away from this. Where would we place ourselves? Crudely, I would say we're in the phase of quote unquote exiting, although the R&D still continues because there's so many untapped opportunities in carbon removal that we still probably don't even know about. And before building a market, we see the initial innings of a market. We see certainly not robust policy support, but the first beginnings of a robust policy support. But we're certainly not at the point where we can think about making it cheap. For some carbon removal methods, we might be more towards the right. For others, we might be more towards the left, which again goes back to the image that I showed you. Carbon removal is not one singular thing. It's a bunch of things that span everything from nature restoration to direct air capture. Now, we just said building a niche market is where we're sort of starting to go. Problem being, and that's the harsh reality of carbon removal these days, no one really needs it, right? I mean, of course, we as a collective need it, and the climate needs it. But if you are a corporate right now, you can do without. If push comes to shove, you can do without. Your climate goals, your climate pledges are probably, your net zero goals are probably 2030, 2035, 2040 onwards. So as of right now, as of 2024, this is all voluntary. And then in a macro environment that is not particularly conducive to you spending money, you can do without. Problem being, a lot of the startups that are developing carbon removal right now are not finding any customers because of this. So they're in this weird situation where in the long run, they know this market is going to be massive. In the short run, they're essentially not solving a problem, which is not a particular position you want to be in as a startup. So we have this peculiar challenge where we now need to build the market so we can realize net zero tomorrow. These startups are not going to just be there in 2045 and deliver megatons and gigatons. We now need to do the work and the support in order for carbon removal to be there when we need it most. So last slide, what do we need right now? We came from the claims, the obscure claims that were being made around climate positive children food, right? We were thinking about you can ski climate neutrally. What we need is to be very clear on what compensation projects can we use to make what kind of claims. Luckily, the EU is working on this. Devina can speak about this a lot better than I can. What we also need is be very clear in our targets, what are reduction targets and what are removal targets, so that we also make sure that the moral hazard is limited, that we don't take removal to avoid doing the quote unquote harder work of reducing. And the startups in particular, or this field in general, needs a bit of clarity on where the market is headed, because clearly this is a public good. And in the end, this will need to become a regulated market, if not even a good that is provided by the state, similar to waste management as we think about it right now. But how does that path towards that look like? Very, very crucial for investors and startups. And lastly, because it is not a problem right now, and because there's very few buyers, there is an important role of the government and others to play to maybe build that niche market themselves by providing procurement incentives and further funding support for these emerging CDR methods that otherwise might have quite a struggle to survive. And that concludes my talk. Thank you all.
Thanks, Marian. That was a really good overview. I'll ask one follow-up question, then sort of open up to you guys if you already have questions. So you mentioned sort of what the current supply is, which was rather minuscule compared to what needs to go. So can you say, and then you sort of like illustrated the different kinds of carbon removal. So very, I mean, from reforestation to direct air capture, very different things. Can you say something about sort of let's say the supply opportunities, like what do you see growing the most? And sort of, do you see something, can you say something about where you will see the largest eventual demand, ideally? Because obviously sort of one important information is that these individual sort of technologies and so on have very different cost points. So yeah, can you say something about that? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think an important distinction to make there, the 1.3 million tons that I talked about is durable carbon removal, right? So that is carbon removal that is stored for an extensive period of time. We already have 2 gigatons of temporary carbon removal that is happening right now, right? But we've had that more or less without us doing a lot for it, right? So that is mostly in the nature restoration space, forestry and other ecosystem restoration. The 1.3 megatons, most of it comes from biochar because it's the most mature technology that can deliver right now. Actually, Germany's, a significant amount of them also come from Germany, both the tech as well as the volume themselves. If we think about the other methods, as I said, carbon removal is not one thing, and it's hard to give you an exact answer as to how that portfolio is going to look. What is clear, we will have a portfolio. It is not going to be a one technology wins all market, not even close, because all these carbon removal methods fundamentally have limitations, be that land availability, be that energy supply, be that biomass availability, be that feedstock availability, storage space. So it will need to be a portfolio, and really the 2030s or the 2020s, up until 2030, our main challenge is to figure out which carbon removal methods work. Do we believe the cost curve projections are realistic? And which ones should be the ones that we go ahead and bet on more significantly? It's very hard to say right now, or picking winners right now would be way too early. Probably the most effective carbon removal solution we actually haven't seen yet.
Thank you, Marian. It's turned on. Oh yeah. Thank you. I have a question. You said you're right now dealing with the question what kinds of storages work, which kinds of carbon removal technologies work, and I wanted to know if you already have some kind of ideas which ones you can actually use for long-term storage, and how you can actually deal with this uncertainty when selling CCS to the industry. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I'm assuming you mean CDR. The terminology is quite important, and I know it can get a bit tricky. So indeed, uncertainty is a very relevant topic in carbon removal, right? Because there are some CDR methods where we can very easily do MRV, measurement reporting verification. We can very easily say, we indeed took out this a ton of CO2 here, and we've stored it there. Think about direct air capture, right? The big fan. You can put just a meter on the gauge, and we measure a ton of gas flowing, right? And we know quite well also that if we store that in geological formations, there are ways for us to make sure and ensure that that is the case, and uncertainty is quite low. Then there are more open system approaches. Think about this enhanced weathering that I just talked about, right? Spreading these alkaline materials, and then you have the rain coming down and it reacts. It is very hard to, with 100% certainty, say 1 ton of CO2 was captured in this location, and it's going to stay durably removed for X amount of time. From like a physics perspective, we know what happens, right? The physics is 100% clear. So probably what we will end up with is some form of uncertainty factor that we will factor in to some of these credits more than others, right? So if a ton of carbon removal on enhanced weathering is sold, that might mean that the model behind says actually 1.3 tons have been removed, just because we, and this is an arbitrary number, right? We believe 30% is the uncertainty. So we overcredit to ensure that we care for those uncertainties. And again, to say which carbon removal method is going to seal the deal, again, it's not going to be one. And giving you a clear answer right now it would be very hard. Also, we've worked with 120 startups up until now, and it's if you were asking, a parent which of their child they like most. Of course, I love them all equally.
Any other questions so far?
Thanks. Thanks, Marian. I guess my question's somewhat related, and dealing with the complexities of all of these technologies. and the projects that support them. You know, we're talking permanence is perhaps in this case the easiest, but you're looking at quality of MRV, quality of, you know, the co-benefits from these different projects. How do you think the market is eventually going to deal with these differences? You know, there's one signal that is price, but how are we going to sort of mature to the level that you can say, okay, 1 ton from a biochar, how does that compare to 1 ton from a, you know, a soil carbon project versus 1 ton from a potentially dodgy marine project that's got all of these other potential harms to the ecosystem? You know, I'm not sure how this is going to be resolved. Can't imagine you know the answer directly either.
No, I don't think anyone knows, quite frankly. So, you know, essentially the question boils down to, do we believe this will become a commodity market? I don't think it will. The carbon removal methods are too different in scope, quality, level of uncertainty, and price that I see this happening anytime soon. Right? So this idea of a ton is a ton is a ton, I do not see that happening. And I do believe in the foreseeable future that is a good thing. Surely stuff like the carbon removal certification framework that is being developed by the EU can help a lot here to actually just provide some guardrails as to fundamentally what is carbon removal and what isn't. And Devina, I'm also looking at you here. You are more in the weeds than I am here, but I don't think it will be able to answer all the questions that we have. It also is a question of what market will we operate under. In a voluntary carbon market, the co-benefits and other elements might be more relevant than in a compliance regime, where co-benefits might be less valuable or relevant if the pure quote-unquote objective is to compensate for a residual emission and thus fulfill your obligations under some sort of scheme. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I do think I would second the fact that this is a very, very tricky one.
Perfect. Unless there are other questions now, but yeah, hand over to Lisa. Yeah. Yes. And sorry, just so Lisa Mangertsreder works as a venture associate at Carbon Removal Partners, leading a venture capital fund in the carbon removal industry. As one of the foremost investors globally, the fund focuses on durable carbon removal technologies. Additionally, Lisa serves as vice chair of the DNVE, so German's National Carbon Removal Association, and co-leads Women in Carbon in Switzerland. She holds a Master of Science Management and Innovation from TU Munich, where a master thesis at ETH Zurich was about investing in carbon removal technologies. So.
I can take that too, yeah. Okay. But I think we need to switch to the other presentation. It's going to be hard for me to present what Devina is about to present. Yeah, perfect. So, we're in Berlin. It's a venture capital city, so I'm talking a bit about venture capital in the carbon removal industry. And yeah, so before I dive into what we're doing, I briefly want to ask, is everybody of you aware what venture capital is in general? I think you're economic students, but I just wanted to...
Maybe you
check.
can just repeat it.
Yeah. I briefly explain. So as a venture capitalist, we invest into startups, very early stage, so when they're quite young, and we take a high risk because we don't know if these startups are going to survive or not, and potentially we will also take a huge return because these startups can grow massively, and so that's our business model. And we do this exclusively in the carbon removal industry. So that means we don't buy the products of these carbon removal startups. And what is the product? That's the carbon credit that they all produce and then eventually sell to companies. We don't invest in these credits, but we invest in the company itself, just to explain this, because sometimes I get asked what we're actually doing. And so, yeah, once back. Okay, so
This is an overview of where we have invested so far. So we have invested in 15 companies globally, and we invest across the different methodologies that Marian just explained. And I want to explain maybe one or two of them, then you have an example of companies that are active in the carbon removal industry. So the first one is direct air capture. That is where you take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then you store it underground. And one that is quite prominent in the space, and you might have heard it, is Climeworks. So they are a company from Switzerland, but they operate in Iceland because there you have green geothermal energy, which is cheap. And so they have huge fans. You can imagine that's like a inverted hair fan. And ambient air flies through this fan. There's a material in the middle. It's called a solid sorbent. This captures the CO2. This is then reheated or like heated up and with a chemical process, but it sounds a bit, sounds bad, but it's not bad. It's just a process that releases the CO2, and then you have this pure CO2 in liquid form. You mix it with water, so you basically have mineral water, like gassy water, and you pump it underground, and that's stored there. And I don't want to say the exact number, but within a couple of years, the majority of the CO2 is actually bound in the geological formations underground, and it's stored. So that is direct air capture. Then we also invest in bikers. That's biochar and BECCS carbon removal technologies. We also invest in enhanced rock weathering. Marian also explained that, where you deploy small grinded rocks on the fields. The water, like the rain comes, it binds the CO2 with the rock, and this is dissolved in the liquid water, and the carbon is then stored permanently. And we also invest in ocean carbon removal solutions, and in the bottom part, in what we call the supportive layer. So the market, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, is very, very novel. So it's a very young market, and this entire market infrastructure that we know from the finance industry, from the insurance industry, is yet to be developed. And so we also invest in these solutions so that this market can grow. And maybe if you know the venture capital field, then maybe you've seen one of these names. So there are globally a lot of other like big names that are interested in investing in climate technologies that put their money in carbon removal because they know that the market is going to grow into $1 trillion market, and you do good, and it's also a huge business opportunity. So that's what I wanted to say about carbon removal partners. And now I want to talk about why investors like us currently invest in the carbon removal industry, and I will dive a little bit deeper into figures and where the industry stands right now. Starting here, I did that for my, to be a little bit academic, I did that for my thesis at ETH, and that shows why venture capital currently is a good source to invest in the market. So we've heard about the TRL scale, that's the middle box here. So that is how developed technologies are. And when you look at the top bars, I think it's really hard to read, but basically those shows in which range the majority of the carbon removal technologies are right now. So they are somewhere between like 3 and 7, 8. And then when we look at the bottom part of the chart, this is a framework developed by the World Fund. And again, it shows like, depending on which development stage, what type of funding is needed so that you can ideally like further develop the technology. And so basically when you combine these three things, you will realize that venture capital right now is an ideal source because these technologies are super young, highly risky, but they have a huge potential to scale up. So oftentimes venture capital funds are the ideal source to give money to these startups because a bank would not invest yet because it's way too risky. So right now, on the next slide, I brought with you some numbers where the industry is currently at. And so roughly we have about 1,000 startups in this area. And just to put this in comparison, there are roughly 8,000 active climate tech startups. This number could be higher. It's always hard to get a really good number because it's a young, it's like, startups, it's hard to count them. And since 2016, there have been 25.4 billion investments, or like money has flown into the carbon removal industry. And again, comparing that to how much has been flowing into the climate tech general sector. So just in 2023, that was a bit over 600 billion. And so carbon removal would have been like 4%, but since 2016. So it's not a lot, but on the other side, since the carbon removal industry is quite nascent, it's also not little. And yeah, there have been 455 investments last year. And companies are across 55 countries. And what we also notice is that there are really carbon hubs. So San Francisco, the Bay Area is a huge one. Then we have a huge one. Germany is actually a huge city for carbon removal. Switzerland too, and the UK, and a couple more. And also important to notice, India and South Africa or Africa are also countries where carbon removal is increasingly on the radar and where we see a lot of activity from startups. So on the next slide, again, a couple more numbers. So, and that those numbers show you how young and novel this industry really is. So these bars dissect where the investment, or like where the deals have been made. And so the pink bars are actually the carbon removal startups that Marian just explained, those that actually take the carbon out of the atmosphere. The second one is companies that then take the captured carbon and turn it into product. So that would be utilization. The third category is point source capture. That's not carbon removal, but this study included it. And the last one is, I think, carbon market and infrastructure, what I explained before, like these horizontal bars. And so the majority of the funding would have was invested in actual carbon removal technologies. And the average company valuation is 10 million. And this sounds like a lot, but actually it's not a lot if you think about how valuable a DAX company is. Like, you know, obviously much more. So these companies are really young. And what I also found quite interesting is that the amount of companies that are valued at below 1 million grew by 280%. So that goes to show that there's a huge increase in new companies being founded every year, or like last year and the years before. And what also goes to show that this industry is super young is that 50% of the companies are actually pre-revenue, so they don't make any revenues yet. So half of them really are just, you know, have just been founded, start to develop their technologies, but they haven't sold anything yet. So, and on the last slide that I brought, that's my rough sketch of the trends that we see in the industry. And my colleague is a quantum, like he studied, or like he did his PhD in quantum science, so he would be really mad for me like showing a graph like that, because it's really rough. But I wanted to briefly explain what I think, or what, you know, what we see, how the industry is developing. So first of all, right now we're at the stage where there's not a lot of data about the carbon removal industry out there. For example, when you combine it with oil and gas industry, you know, you have standardized reports, you can go to Bloomberg and Reuters, you have all the market data. For CDR, we don't have that. There's CDR.FYI, which I highly recommend. It's like the best data source. And you have BCG starting to produce reports, etc. But I see that this is gonna increase massively over the next few years. Likewise, the spot availability, and by that I mean that you can like go on the market and buy a credit and just, you know, use it and retire it and say, this is my credit now. Right now, the majority of the credits that companies purchase, they purchase them for the future. So they're not there yet. They have not been removed yet. They will be removed in the future. But as the industry grows, the number of credits that are available that you can purchase and directly then retire, that will increase. The number of policies, and I think we will learn a lot more about that in a second, will also increase. And I feel like there's a bit of like a hesitation in a lot of this information, but I would assume that there will be a huge spike of policies actually coming into place. And we see this in Germany. Actually, this year, 3 policies are, you know, being updated and then released. The next one, we will see entrance of existing industries, and by that I refer to the financial industry. So for example, forward and future trading, you will see that with carbon removal credits. Right now, spot availability is not there yet, but as soon as these become more available, you will see the financial industry to come in much more heavily. It already started, but much more. Insurance industry, super important one. Then trading, the entire commodity trading industry, they will all come into the market and also significantly increase it. Then failure of startups. Just last week, I read the first news about a startup that went bankrupt. That's going to happen. That will increase, of course, also over the next few years. And with that also comes a consolidation of the industry. I think a couple of these firms that have now been formed will consolidate. And lastly, and I think that's a very important point, the price of the credits will come down. And that's probably something we'll also discuss a bit more. But currently, depending on the method, but this one credit currently costs somewhere, it can cost up to $1,000. And if you look at the ETS price, the carbon is somewhere like 70, 60. So there's a huge difference there. And these prices will come down. That's it from my side.
Excellent, great. Thanks so much for the great presentation. Again, I'll start with one question, then I'll open up. So, as you said, so you're coming from a fund perspective. I'm wondering if you were to put together like a portfolio of different carbon technologies, carbon removal technologies, sort of for an investor, like how would you, I mean, of all the different sort of options that Marian explained, can you give sort of some kind of intuition of how you would put something together, and then you compared it to the oil industry? I was wondering, over the keynote over lunch, we heard a lot about like Dutch disease and sovereign wealth funds. Let's say the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia wanted to invest in this. Like, is this something which could actually help the sector mature more rapidly? Because like essentially what you're saying is it's very nascent, a lot of young startups, probably, not a lot of capital, like the assets of large corporations are not that there yet, whereas like the big oil and gas corporates will need to diversify. So could that potentially be some kind of like stepping stone in fast tracking progress?
Yeah, very interesting questions. I'll start with the first one. And I definitely agree with Marian that we will need a portfolio approach of solutions, and we also see buyers doing that. So, for example, Swiss Re is one of the first to purchase carbon credits, carbon removal credits, and they invest into a portfolio of carbon removal solutions. And that makes sense from various perspectives, because you diversify your impact and you diversify your risk. And so, I mean, the price, obviously, that really depends on the industry. There are industries that are more willing to pay for carbon removal, and others that are less willing to pay for carbon removal. But, I mean, from one reason why it makes sense is, so for example, biochar, we've heard that before, is readily available, and you already see like huge volumes of biochar biochar credits being available, whereas direct air capture, which are very expensive right now, there's only a small portion available, and these are from the first plants that are developed, but these plants are super, super young and super early. And they're not at the technological development that they will be in the future. So what I want to say is direct air capture will have a huge increase past 2030, whereas biochar is already there, so you maybe want to balance it out. And biochar has a natural limit because you have a limit on the biomass that's available. And so just as an example, so you could, for example, balance those two out. And then, mix a bunch of other portfolios in. And of course, you also maybe want to have co-benefits that you have from afforestation credits, increase biodiversity, et cetera, and those are all points that we see corporates including in their purchase decisions. And the second question, yes, definitely. I think should governments or sovereign wealth funds that like used to put their money into the oil industry? Should they invest in carbon removal? And would it help? Definitely, because the industry is super novel and nascent, as I said, and it definitely needs much more funding to scale and to bring these or move these technologies up the technological readiness scale, and having these investments in the infrastructure, in the capex, etc., and maybe also bringing in knowledge would be super helpful. Yeah.
Great, super interesting. Any questions from the audience so far?
Thank you. Hi. One question. At the beginning of your presentation, if I understood correctly, you mentioned as a business model of this startup, basically selling the carbon credits. And the first question is like, is that the only business model that we see out there, or do you see out there? And the second one, how would that work with also from a VC perspective, as also in your last chart that you see the price of credit going down? So maybe on the long term it doesn't work so well. So how was that perspective?
Also a very good question. No, there are also other types of revenues beyond the credits, depending on the method. So again, direct air capture, that's a pure credit play, so to say. They don't have anything else to sell. When you look at the biochar industry, so again, you take biomass that when it grows, pyrolysis, it binds CO2. You use a pyrolysis machine, and the carbon is locked into the biochar that you have in the end. So, but then that's a product, right? So this biochar you can use and you can sell it to farmers, and it also has a market price which like heavily depends where on the world you sell it. Sometimes you cannot really sell it, but it's actually increasing because we've also heard earlier it can be used in the cement industry, it can be used in metallurgy, not sure about the English word. So this you can sell. And in biochar, you also have heat that is like a co-product, and you can sell distant heat. And so you have 3 revenue streams. There are also potential other revenue streams in afforestation, reforestation, like you could, I don't know, have parks and people can pay interest, which wouldn't be so attractive for us as a VC investor, but there are other potential revenue streams. And there's one startup from Germany called Greenlight. They co-produce hydrogen. So you have green hydrogen and you have direct air capture, or like captured CO2 that you can store. So, yeah. And what was the second part? Sorry.
From the VC perspective, what's the concept is in a sense? You want to ideally get out before the credit price goes down, or how do you look at it?
Not necessarily. I mean, for us, it's a good sign if the credit price or the unit economics come down, because then there will be more demand. Like logically, I think that's the supply and demand question. And of course, then the companies are more competitive. But of course, it needs to make sense. First, you want to understand, are the costs below, or can the costs at some point come below the price that you want to sell the credit for? So that is definitely a super important aspect that we look at. For us as an investor, we tend to support the startups from somewhere earlier than first of a kind plan. Maybe when they have really depends, but first prototype, and then during the time they build their first of a kind plant, and maybe sell the first plants, or deploy their first, project, etc. And then the companies become too big, and the next wave of investors would come in, and we sell our stake to them, or the company's IPO, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and insightful knowledge nuggets already. I'm curious to hear more about your investment focus, because if we look at only the carbon removal technologies, I would assume, or I would say that from also Marian's input, that it's a more risky investment in comparison to other verticals where there are actually markets and demands. And now you're saying that you're kind of balancing it out and compensating the missing market demand through your fundings. And I'm just curious to hear, there are some moonshot technologies, I would say, that needs more time and more funding so they can actually be impactful, but that would be years later, so to say. And there are other technologies, for example, biochar, where it's already like in the pipeline to be impactful soon-ish. And where do you prioritize where you want to invest? Because I would assume that also as the business model of AVC, you are looking for investments which will at some point bring back revenue, right? So you are also financially viable.
That is absolutely correct, and it's a very good question. And I fully understand how you got to that question, because so typically VCs, or different way to answer it. We take full market risk. If the carbon removal market is not coming, then of course our entire fund, you know, if policy is not supporting carbon removal, if no companies are buying it, if, I don't know, society decides carbon removal is not for us, then our fund, our investments are going down and won't be profitable. So definitely we take 100% the market risk, but we are huge believers that the carbon removal industry is growing and it needs to grow. I mean, definitely we all have a huge problem if we don't manage to like scale this industry. So first, market risk, yes. Then when we talk about the technology risk, I feel like since we do carbon removal 24/7, everybody of us in the team, and we have a very science-driven perspective. So as I mentioned, my colleague did his PhD in quantum physics, and my other colleagues in chemistry, super smart and super knowledgeable. They do nothing else than assessing these technologies. So I think we have a better competitive advantage by really, really understanding well where we put our money and understanding where the unit economics can come down and where we see this profitable business case. So that's one aspect. And then I think you mentioned where we invest. Yeah. Among all these technologies, where we like to invest, first is, as I said, anything that's scientifically proven and like solid. Second, anything that is measurable and permanent. So for us, it's super important that you can measure how much CO2 did you take out, and is this because, and we will hear about that in a second, we believe that long-term carbon removal will be part of compliance market. Compliance markets are regulated. You have a certain price, and so whatever can come in one way or the other into the compliance markets, that's where we invest. And then, yeah. But right now, of course, many VCs are like, we don't understand the market, we don't understand the technologies, we are a bit hesitant, we will wait and see. And that's fine, and yeah, we think that we know what we do. So that's why we invest.
Perfect, great. So as Lisa, you said, the market needs to grow and sort of eventually, ideally becomes a compliance market. So I want to hand over to Devina to give us a bit more sort of background and information about the policy side. So Devina is an associate director at Carbon Gap, based in London. She leads Carbon Gap's UK work in program and strategic projects to advance carbon removal markets across the whole of Europe. Devina has experience in climate and scientific policy making, having worked in the UK government's carbon capture and storage program and COVID-19 vaccine task force. So Devina, over to you.
Thank you. Great. So I'm going to present a little bit about the policy framework for carbon removal. Alluded by Marian and Lisa, it's going to be pivotal in the scale-up of the market. And I think it's a really fascinating policy challenge in green innovation. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of different policies that need to come together in a cohesive framework. So that's kind of what I'm going to outline today. I work at Carbon Gap. We are a dedicated NGO for carbon removal policy in Europe, and based in Brussels, doing a lot of work with EU institutions. And I myself am based in the UK, working with the UK government on their upcoming policies. So can I move slide? Yes. Perfect. Great. Okay, so we have made some inroads already with carbon removal policy. It's now recognized pretty substantially across the mainstream, be it the IPCC, the European Commission, as a third pillar of climate action, alongside emission reductions and adaptation. We are seeing within Europe some dedicated policy instruments that are fundamental to the scale up of carbon removal. So we've talked in Marianne's presentation about the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is all around setting the standards for what counts as a carbon removal, the quality thresholds, the methodologies that different techniques have to meet. We are seeing the Green Claims Directive coming in, which is all about governing what carbon removal can be used for. So what kinds of corporate claims can be made with different types of carbon removal, and so on and so forth. So lots of interesting stuff happening already. And the CDR sector, as we've heard, is already starting to take off. But as the recognition of the role of CDR has been increasing, we do need to see the policy kind of picking up pace in the same way. So a few new challenges coming with the growth of carbon removal and its recognition. We are seeing that the long-term plan and ambition for CDR isn't quite in place. That's not helping kind of the investment landscape and the sort of impending valley of death for CDR companies until we have that clarity on the long-term trajectory. We're seeing a lot of gaps in the policy framework. So while some pieces are coming into place, some of the initial building blocks, a lot more needs to be done. CDR entrepreneurs are struggling to navigate kind of the diffuse support in the EU framework. Some methods still being under-researched. Agree with Marianne, probably the best solutions we haven't found yet, so we still need to be doing the R&D, initial research and exploration. And there are still some legitimate concerns around governance. So public trust and is still an issue, and without the public kind of buy-in and trust, it's very hard to get the kind of government action at the scale and pace that we need. So at Carbon Gap, we've this year put out a publication calling for an EU CDR strategy and what would need to be within that to encompass a sort of comprehensive sort of base of European climate policy for carbon removals. So if we start at the bottom with the kind of enabling conditions for carbon removal to scale, absolutely fundamental is the target setting, so that we've got a mandate and a clear trajectory for where we want to go as we reach net zero and beyond that into a net negative future. Within targets, very important that we have the separate targets for reductions and removals, kind of recognizing that one shouldn't affect the ambition in the other. Another enabling condition is the kind of the rules and the standards around the governance of credits and the uses of them. So kind of clear regulation and standards around carbon removals. And the third kind of enabling condition that kind of sits underneath and underpins this whole thing is the actual physical infrastructure itself. So, you know, particularly when we're thinking about direct air capture and that kind of thing, these are kind of huge sort of physical infrastructure challenges as well. A lot of it can be reused, for example, from the oil and gas sector, but we kind of need to do this assessment of what's the best solutions, what's the most cost effective, what's the most, the best way to get to where we need to be. And then more sort of proactively now that we are starting to address each of these enabling conditions already, are the kind of what we've set out as 4 key pillars for carbon removal policy. So number 1 would be the research and development. So things like the EU's Horizon Fund. How can that be better purposed and increased in ambition so that we can be really identifying the research gaps for the best solutions. The second is around the deployment incentives. So the kind of bridging mechanisms then from early innovation in the lab through to kind of commercial deployment at scale. And again, policy is going to play a really important role here, similar to how it did with offshore wind and solar and the likes. The third is all around the enduring long-term policy mechanisms. And this is where things like the European emission trading system comes in. What's the kind of long-term economic case or kind of policy case as to why removals are going to be kind of a recipient of corporate funding, and also what's the long-term case for government support as we get towards net zero. And the fourth area, which I think is a little bit neglected generally when we're talking about carbon removal, is the opportunity for this to be a new, kind of a new industry being built now that can have at its core a lot of socially responsible principles. So that's something we're really interested in as well. Okay, so I have a little bit of an overview of each of these pillars, and I'll keep it to quite a high level because we have the report to read in full for any of these that you're more interested in. And we also want some time to discuss. But in pillar number 1, really this is all around building on the EU's successful track record so far on clean tech. And the goal here is to reduce uncertainty for carbon removal as a whole. We still need to kind of prove or disprove which are the best technologies, which are the most financially viable, what are the co-benefits, and what are the risks. So, you know, we are very interested in the kind of global or rather multilateral funding power of the EU to really bottom out some of these questions. And we are seeing kind of that this is going to be a big topic for the Commission going forwards. In pillar number 2, when it comes to bringing carbon removal from the lab to the field, we are very interested in instruments such as feed-in tariffs, procurement programs, and contracts for difference, which would support the scaling up and down costing of CDR methods, as they've done for a lot of other climate technologies in the past. What's really important here is that we accelerate the learning curve. So move from, in order to move from the lab to the field, we're going to need public and private financing kind of in conjunction in the early stages to support that early stage deployment. We recommend that the EU does procure carbon removal. So this is kind of some active advocacy that we're doing now with the European Commission as to how a pilot procurement program could be created. If you're interested in this, the US has done some really amazing carbon removal procurement recently. So we think the EU should be kind of looking and doing similar things. And then in the longer term, we're really interested in things like the emissions trading system, but maybe something even more bespoke. because we've talked a lot today about how there's different carbon removal methods, the permanence is different, the MRV, the kind of logic behind different removals is different, and the permanence of a fossil emission needs to be met with a permanence of storage, like for like. So we actually think that alongside the ETS or a similar mechanism, we are going to need to see kind of diverse and stacked layers of compliance for different removals methods. So this is, again, an idea of thinking about land removals, what's the best way of incentivizing those in the long term, probably through looking at payments for farmers and incentives in that sense. With more permanent removals, something like the ETS, or an alternative would be a new trading system just for removals, which would give us a lot more control over the types of units and credits that are going into there, and making sure that that's not inadvertently affecting the effectiveness of the ETS as it is in reaching net zero. So these are kind of long-term policy mechanisms that need to be kind of put in place and signaled today so that the market gets the right messages. And pillar 4 is all around fair and inclusive governance. So the EU's ability to research social and ethical dimensions. So overall, we think a lot of the key enabling conditions are in place for carbon removal policy, but it's really time to start thinking about the long term, the kind of next few years, the deployment incentives that will help these solutions get to commercial scale, and in the long term, what's the logic? What's the kind of the need for CDR if you're a company or a corporate investor? What's the kind of the long-term story for carbon removal? And just something short to end. To achieve great things, 2 things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. For carbon removal, we all agree that the second condition is met, but now let's kind of work on the first one, the plan.
Perfect. I'm going to sort of start with a question. So a while back, so like a solar PV cell required more electricity in its production than it would produce over a lifetime. And back in the day, people would say, well, it's sort of like a stupid technology that, you know, it doesn't make sense to use. Whereas now it's like the cheapest source of electricity in the globe, mostly. And another sort of similar technology is that in 2006, I believe that George Clooney and Arnold Schwarzenegger were 2 of the first people to buy a Tesla Roadster when it still cost like $100,000 at the time. And so this effectively sort of helped it become cheap in the long run, which is also sort of Marian mentioned the book Why Solar Became Cheap, as well as sort of like these advanced market commitments by Microsoft. So can these play like a similar role as sort of this niche demand with you know, so like the first consumers of the Tesla, or sort of like this long development for solar PV that we can, like, what can we emulate, what can we learn from that to fast-track progress? Because as you rightly said, Devina, so like we're short on time. So yeah, what would you say, sort of like these corporates, do they play a similar role, and sort of can they be part of the solution?
Yes, absolutely. I think things, for example, like contracts for difference, are going to be a really useful tool for carbon removal solutions. And that's not just in terms of the kind of the initial government subsidy to make these kind of technologies more competitive, but it's also the kind of implicit sort of stamp from a government that has made this scheme that really helps to unlock investment. And what we're really trying to do is get the investment in there so that, you know, these technologies can keep, keep deploying. We keep learning the lessons from that, and we keep bringing costs down.
Great. Any questions from the audience at this point?
Maybe I just start before I give away my microphone. It is a question to you, Devina. So you said we still have to work on a plan, and the EU is not quite there where it can allow for offsets within the ETS. You said something about extra removal trading system. How do you have precise what's it called? Details on how this should look like so it doesn't go wrong?
So I think the question about whether removals should be traded with emission allowances in the ETS, it's very live discussion at the moment. And there's a number of considerations. And actually, I think with the right guardrails in place, either option can work. So it's really a policy design question. But when we're thinking about removals and the ETS, some of the key things we want to think about are permanence. So, you know, the majority of, I think, if not all, but the majority of emissions in the ETS are fossil emissions. The lifetime of those in the atmosphere is 1,000 years plus. So the durability of storage should match that. What does that mean in terms of how an ETS integration or a separate system is designed? I think both can work. So you can either have the system whereby only certain removals that meet a certain kind of threshold of permanence, likewise for MRV, likewise for other quality standards like environmental standards, can enter the ETS, but we think it's really important to have all these guardrails in place. When it comes to a separate system, to me, the reason why that would be preferable is that we can be a little bit more planned about the levels of removals that we are wanting to ensure are kind of obligated. So with the ETS, whichever is the cheapest, whether it be an allowance or a removal unit, is generally what will be the most incentivized. With a separate sort of removals obligation, we can ensure that there's kind of a growing scale for companies as they reach their kind of final emissions in the ETS to be meeting those with a scaling amount of removals that they're financing or doing themselves.
Thanks.
Hi. Maybe question to Devina first. As you are working in, during your work, what do you consider as the main challenge in the carbon CDR sector at this moment, and what kind of policy do you expect the governments to kind of offer to help your work easier?
Good question. I think the biggest challenge for working in CDR at the moment is the kind of disparity in where all the different methods are. Some of them, as we've heard about, like biochar, are already kind of available today. Some of them are very far in the future and are going to need, you know, long-term offtake agreements and long-term support before they're even built at a commercial scale. All sorts of different stages of, you know, can we accurately measure the amount of carbon that's being stored and so on. So I think the EU's taken the absolutely best first step because they've started with the carbon removal certification framework, and that's going to really help the industry to kind of go forward from there in terms of, what standards does everyone have to meet. I work with the UK government, and they are doing things a little bit more backwards. So they're starting with the contracts for difference, but everyone's still a bit confused as to, okay, but what do we have to meet in order to be eligible for this? So I think the EU's doing it right, and I think I'm excited for that to kind of come into force. So, the next policy that I would hope to see then is really clear governance on the use cases for carbon removal. So when am I allowed to use carbon removal to claim net zero? And the governance around that is super important.
Cool, thank you. And my next question is dedicated to you. I'm curious whether you are at the VC, your VC only focus on the European market, or is expanding to the Asian market as well. And during your work, do you also have concerns about like greenwashing, which is like a compliance issue?
Thanks for the question. So no, we actually invest globally. So half of our portfolio is in the US, Canada, simply because there are a lot of companies, because there's a lot of research in the area. So a lot of companies have been spun out or have been developed in the US. But we can invest globally, and we also do. So we also see a lot in India. Recently talked to a couple of Indian companies, which are very interesting and promising, because India is just well suited for a couple of CDR methodologies. Also in South Africa, we haven't invested yet, but I mean, we will see what the future holds. So that's definitely possible. I know that China is the biggest, or like has the highest number of patents filed in the CDR space, but I don't have that. It seems a bit more further distance, and it's not so easy to get really into that market, to be very honest. So I don't know that well what's happening on the innovation side, but I mean, definitely also super interesting in the future and relevant for us to understand. And the second question, sorry, I'm always like forgetting the second one.
It's about greenwashing.
Oh yeah. I mean, greenwashing in I think what's a risk is that it's not permanent, or that it doesn't work, or that the science goes wrong. But greenwashing, I mean, for us, and we look at the company, like we invest in the company. So what can go wrong for us is that the tech doesn't work or doesn't do what it wants. I think the greenwashing issue is more on the companies that purchase the credit, or those who look at those companies and do what are they doing and what is their strategies to get to net zero. Generally, in this whole carbon market, there have been like huge issues with credits that didn't work. So, and that was mainly in the afforestation, reforestation space, where, for example, you throw out some seeds from a plane, but the trees never grew, or there would have been forest like wildfires, and all the trees burned down, etc. And obviously, then it's double harming, because you assume you did something good, and you produce emissions somewhere else for reducing them with forests, and then the forest didn't grow, etc. So that's obviously an issue, and sad. But I feel like the industry is maturing and learning a lot, so trying to avoid that as much as possible, much more careful. Whereas on the other side, like the more technical removals, there it's less of a problem, because there you have this MRV in place, which Marian already mentioned. Also a lot of open questions, but yeah, it's developing and it's moving forward, and we try to like really look closely at that and understand, is it measurable? Can you really prove that you have one credit there, or what are the mechanisms to then only like have some buffer pool in place, etc., etc. Yeah.
So my question would be maybe a little bit more for the now than for the future. What are kind of physically, scientifically proven concepts which capture energetically wise large amounts of CO2 already, and maybe a company you're investing into doing that technology?
I think it really depends on a company level. So in every sector or method, I think there are companies that are further advanced and further up the technological scale, and some are younger that are still developing their tech. So for example, direct air capture, the most advanced one that we invested in would be Climeworks. They already built their plants, so they are already quite advanced. But even they have a tech team, or a science team of, I think, 100 people or so. So they are still constantly working and improving their science, their solvents, etc. So all of them are still, working on that. I feel like when you look at, for example, enhanced rock weathering, where you deploy the grinded rocks on the field, this is simple. Like, it's like agricultural business. This is solved. There's nothing complicated about it. What's complicated there is the MRV. So it's the science, or the science, open science questions are in the MRV part. So it really depends. But all methods are, there's still a lot of questions to solve in all of the methods. Did it answer your question?
Kind of.
Kind of. Maybe also Marian, who is running an accelerator, knows that quite well, not to forget him.
Yeah, no, I'm still here. No, I appreciate the question. It's a hard one to answer, but let's say you were asking about the now, right? If you're a corporate right now and you want to buy carbon removal that is available right now, you are essentially, and you want to make sure it's durable, right? Let's stick to the durable part. So say at least 100 years, ideally more than 500, if not more years, you're probably going to buy biochar carbon removal. That is about 90% of the durable market these days. There are a vast majority of companies working, delivering these carbon removal biochar tons. Interestingly, this isn't necessarily a VC case. That's way, if you, for instance, look at the portfolio of carbon removal partners, you also didn't see a lot of investments in the bikers, and in particular in the biochar space, just because this lends itself more to sort of a classic project development business model, and not we develop tech and then scale this massively, like the hockey curve growth that you need for a VC fund math to work. On the other end, on the nature restoration side, so if you wanted to say, I decrease my level of ambition on the durability side, I'm okay with 50 years of durability because, for instance, I'm compensating for an emission in the agricultural space. Say I'm compensating for methane emissions. Those are not going to stay in the atmosphere for long anyways. So you could argue, okay, a temporary removal is fine. Then the options broaden, right? You can buy afforestation, you can buy mangrove restoration. There are soil carbon credits that you can buy from. And in any of these sectors, you have players that are more established, and you have young incumbents startups that are developing something differently. So I would sort of tend to go with Lisa. It's very hard to give you one concrete answer just because the maturity of startups is quite different.
Thank you, all three of you, for your insights. This question goes to anyone who would like to respond to it. I'm wondering, in the non-scientific realm of climate policy and politics, carbon CCS is often seen as like the one joker to pull if you can't be bothered switching to an electrical vehicle or so. How do you make sure in your communications that any kind of removal is not being misunderstood as a way out of more climate ambition?
There's one sentence that Misha Rebmann, who developed the carbon removal purchase strategy for Swiss Re, who he's amazing. He's such a smart person and really kickstarted a lot for other corporates to follow. So he said, he runs with the sentence, do your best, remove the rest. And I like that it's simple. Of course, you should quantify it if you want to be then specific, but basically, I think we all agree, and everybody in the carbon removal industry, I think agrees, or should agree, hopefully, that we need to reduce emissions as much as possible. The problem is this first part of the sentence, do your best. We simply, we don't. We don't do our best. And so we've heard earlier in the talk from, I had to note down the name, Sion Kapoor, that why are we still talking about 1.5 degrees? We're past that point. We need to talk about 2 degrees. And so we need carbon removal, we are where we need it, we really need to push forward to deploy these technologies because, as I said, very young, still many open questions. It takes time to develop them, to have them at the scale that we need them. 10 gigaton, we have 1% of that today, 1%. So yes, we need to do, we're definitely running out of capacity on all ends. We need to reduce much more, but we also need to remove. We need to reduce and we need to remove. And it's a tough question, and we definitely shouldn't see it as a way to avoid doing something. Probably there will be some that see it that way, for sure. All we can do is try to make everybody aware of doing both kind of simultaneously, but yeah, that's my answer.
Hi. Thank you, all three. Did you want to answer? Then I would leave you to answer the last question. Okay. Yeah, thank you, all three. My question also goes to all three. I understand the need for carbon removal. I have a bit of maybe a lack of understanding of the economics of it. So if we look at the midterm, the scaling up phase, would you expect a cannibalization effect? As penetration increases, the value of carbon removal decreases, as we've seen with solar and wind? Or do you think this doesn't really have an effect? And in the very long run, in a mature market, doesn't carbon removal necessarily require increasing emissions to be a sustainable business model? Or is that also not a concern? Yeah, can tell me if my economic intuition is completely wrong, or
I can address the latter of the two, which is a really interesting question, which is how do we incentivize net negative, a net negative economy? So you're no longer compensating for a ton emitted with a ton removed, and what's that new logic that we can create? And there's different ways of kind of thinking about this, whether you're thinking about responsibility for historic emissions. All of this is very open, but open questions, by the way. But at what point could we start to attribute historical emissions to corporate actors? Is that possible? Debate. Should responsibility for historical emissions be split across countries, and what's the kind of mechanism for that? But also in the long term, what's the upside of a corporate financing emissions when it's no longer compensatory? So it's no longer about net zero, but rather just contributing towards bringing the climate back to sustainable levels. So what's the kind of narrative that can be created there? And even at the kind of large policy instrument scale, how could for example, the emissions trading system become net negative? So what kind of policies, design questions are there around bringing the ETS not just to net zero, but beyond that?
just really briefly, I would say that I think sort of like the eventual cost regressions, that's exactly what we would want to see. So like it becoming cheap, that's essentially sort of what needs to happen in order for there to be a real market case. So because essentially currently there's no real business case, as Marian was saying, sort of because essentially like removing a ton of carbon costs up to 1,000 euros, whereas like the price in the EU ETS, for example, is around 100 or like a little less. Like the social cost of carbon is around 300, so there's a huge difference. Bringing that down is sort of where we need to go, and I think sort of there's one sort of nice intuition in the book, right? Is like, I mean, if you think of it as like a bathtub, right? I think and you just pull the plug at the bottom, then I think there's more than enough emissions still to be removed in order for this to be like a sustainable business model once it sort of there's a business case and the market is mature enough. And sort of even, I think, Marian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe like Microsoft is even planning to sort of remove their historical emissions going backwards. So yeah, but all of this, I believe, is still sort of like part of this very small niche market. So essentially like, yeah, the other book, sort of Why Solar Became Cheap, I think is an interesting one. It sort of depicts how the solar industry sort of became cheap. And at the very beginning, it was actually like, I think the US military and oil rigs were the only customers that were had enough purchasing power to buy solar cells when they were just astronomically high. So that's where, yeah, I don't know how many of you were here at the very beginning, sort of very first slides of all these, you know, cost curves going down. I think sort of carbon removal is still very early, sort of very far up. So we still got a very long way to go. But in the interest of time, unless, I don't know, maybe our three panelists each have sort of like, yeah, like a closing statement of where we stand. But I think sort of when we thought about, you know, organizing like this whole three panels of the event, I think for carbon removal, it's still very early on. It's still a lot needs to happen. So a lot of work for Marian, Lisa, and Devina. And so, yeah, but obviously also like very exciting for, depending on like where your interest lies. I think there's a lot of very good work still to be done. And so, yeah, maybe each one of you, I don't know if you have any sort of last observations or comments, Marian, Lisa.
Okay, or do you want to? I can go ahead. Yeah, so I mean, I'm super optimistic about the carbon removal industry. I think it's a fascinating industry. The scale to which it will grow, I think we need a lot of imagination to like really understand how big it's gonna be. So basically, we're reversing the oil and gas industry. So and you know how big the oil and gas industry is. It's massive, right? So a lot will happen no matter what background you have. Like everybody's needed in this industry, and the opportunities are vast. So what I find fascinating is that since it's still in its early days, you have like very short distances to reach everybody, and people are super optimistic and helpful and like collaborative. So the power and the dynamics are, I really love it. Like, I mean, I'm carbon removal top to toe. And yeah, I'm optimistic. I know that it's going to be a bumpy ride, and there will be some startup failures. There will be some, you know, frauds, etc. Of course, like that's going to happen, like in every other industry. But overall, yeah, I think I'm positive. We see a lot on the policy side. We see a lot on the market side. We need more buyers. More people need to come in. More innovators need to be there. But that's going to happen. And yeah, I encourage you all to look into the industry, maybe apply at some point to one of the startups, one of the innovators, etc., do research in this area. Read the book. That's my closing statement. Thanks for having me.
Marian, any final words?
Nothing to add. If I had a mic, I would drop it now because that was the perfect summary.
Thank you.
I won't drop it, but yeah, big round of applause. Thank you all. Thanks for staying so long, and thanks for coming.